You may have heard the term paranoid schizophrenic or catatonic schizophrenic, but those words aren't being used as often anymore, and they seem to be trickling out of style. So why is that? Schizophrenia isn't diagnosed the same way that it used to be. In 2013, when the newest DSM, the DSM-5, was published, the subtypes of schizophrenia were kind of eradicated. Up until then, up until the DSM-4, there had been 5 types of schizophrenia that were used to diagnose this disorder. Whereas now, since 2013, we consider schizophrenia to be a spectrum. But some people with paranoia are more likely to have certain features, such as paranoia or hallucinations. I, for instance, don't have a lot of hallucinations when I'm psychotic, but I always have paranoia. Always. These symptoms were used to determine the classification of the different types of schizophrenia. There were 5 types of schizophrenia described in the DSM-4, and these were the disorganized type, undifferentiated type, residual type, paranoid type, and catatonic type. While the features of these types, such as paranoia, disorganized speech and behavior, and catatonia, are still features of schizophrenia, issues like overlapping symptoms and the low diagnostic precision were factors in why they're no longer considered distinct subtypes. So let's talk about the specific types. The paranoid subtype is the most commonly diagnosed, and it consists of having a preoccupation with one or more delusions and having auditory hallucinations, and also other symptoms like disorganized speech and thought, and having a flat affect and having inappropriate emotional responses are not prominent. So that would be the first. The second is the disorganized type, which is also called hebephrenic schizophrenia. And this is having disorganized speech and thought, nonsensical speech, having a flat affect, having a lack of or inappropriate emotional responses. Say someone says something very sad and you would laugh, things like that. It has also an absence of delusions and hallucinations. Then the residual type is when a person who has previously been diagnosed with schizophrenia no longer has the prominent symptoms of hallucinations and delusions, but they will still have other symptoms like the flat affect and having distorted thinking, stuff like that. The catatonic type is one of the rarest types of schizophrenia, and it is composed of either excessive movement, known as catatonic excitement, or a decreased movement, otherwise known as catatonic stupor. People with this subtype may not react to stimuli, or they may have their bodies in strange positions or make odd movements. They may have more rigidity in their limbs. And it also can include mutism, which is an inability to speak, echolalia, which is mimicking other people's words, and echopraxia, which is mimicking other people's body movements. And finally, there's the undifferentiated subtype, which is used to describe people whose symptoms match more than one subtype. So yeah, it is absolutely fascinating stuff, and I think it's particularly fascinating because I absolutely know people who have been diagnosed with these subtypes, and I just barely missed that window because I was diagnosed in 2015. It's amazing how much has changed in just 10 years in the community, and with the knowledge we have today of the spectrum, which wasn't even considered a spectrum that long ago. So it's interesting to keep in mind that there are people who still use these diagnoses. I've met people who say that they are a paranoid schizophrenic, and so while that is not used anymore, it is still within touch, and it wasn't that long ago that these were used. One series of symptoms of psychosis that I feel is often overlooked is disorganized speech and thinking, otherwise known as formal thought disorder. Formal thought disorder is a way of thinking that leads to abnormal ways of expressing language through speaking and writing. such as speaking very quickly and stumbling over words and changing the subject in conversation rapidly because of racing thoughts and jumping from one thought to the other. It wasn't mentioned in scientific literature until the 1980s, in which it was loosely described as any disturbance in the organization and processing of ideas. There are actually over 20 subtypes of thought disorders, but we're just going to focus on a few of them today. The first is one that I'm very familiar with, and this is called alogia, otherwise known as poverty of speech. And this is a diminished ability to communicate through language, whether that be through speaking or through sign language. This can look like taking long pauses between words when you speak, or giving very limited answers when asked a question. For myself personally, I could really only answer yes or no questions. I couldn't speak full sentences, and that was about all I was capable of. Next is thought blocking, which is kind of where your thoughts just stop. If you were to be having a conversation, you may be just communicating fine and then stop, like mid-sentence, completely interrupt your own sentence, and then maybe have seconds or even minutes between speech where you don't say anything. And then when you do start speaking again, it could be a completely different topic. Your thoughts have literally been blocked. Derailment is talking in only chains of semi-related ideas that fall further and further from the original topic of conversation. So let's say I was talking about cooking, and that made me think of my red spatula, and I would mention that, which would lead to me changing the subject to the tomatoes that I've grown, which would change me to talking about how I'd love a pet rabbit because they commonly go through gardens. Echolalia is repeating sounds or words, so if someone were to say, "Hi, how are you?" you would repeat back to them, "Hi, how are you?" There's also perseveration, which is a repetition of words or ideas. There's also neologism, which is creating new words. And finally, there's incoherence, which is speaking in a random collection of words, which is commonly known as word salad. So those are just a few examples of thought disorders, and I find it very fascinating because until I learned about them, I had no idea that I had thought disorders to begin with. And so when I would see in, the DSM and stuff that it would say disorganized thinking, I had no idea that that was something that I had personally experienced. I love learning about this stuff because it helps me to better understand what I've been through, because it was unexplainable when I found out that I'd had psychosis. So I hope that by sharing this with you, maybe you better understand your own experiences or the experiences of your loved ones going through psychosis, or at the very least, just enjoy learning this stuff like me. What do autism and schizophrenia have in common? A lot more than you'd think. There's been a lot of buzz about all of the overlap between psychotic and autistic symptoms. For instance, on one of my recent videos, I talked about the thought disorders associated with psychosis, and a lot of those disorders happen with autism too. And while there are a lot of differences, like the onset time, for instance, autism sets on in early childhood development, and schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders tend to come on later towards the end of adolescence. A growing number of studies are finding overlaps in genetic studies, neuroimaging data, clinical signs, and cognitive features. People with autism are actually at a higher likelihood of developing psychosis or having psychotic experiences than the general population. Psychosis typically occurs in 1 in 100 people, but research is increasingly suggesting that more than 3 in 100 autistic people experience psychosis. That's 3 times more than the general population. In fact, with such a high comorbidity percentage of anywhere from 34.8 to 60%, it's not unlikely that a person could both have autism and a psychotic experience or psychotic disorder. Because of this high comorbidity rate between autism and psychosis, it's been hypothesized that there is a significant vulnerability of developing psychosis in people with neurodevelopmental disorders. Actually, people used to think that autism in and of itself was psychosis. Before it got its own entry in the DSM, Autism was diagnosed as childhood onset schizophrenia. It was historically diagnosed as schizophrenia. When it got its own category in 1980, the criteria prohibited dual diagnosis of autism and schizophrenia, perhaps to steer clear of the previous confusion. So autism and schizophrenia have a rich history, and while they do have a lot in common, they also have their differences. There's nonetheless a strong link between the two, and it's not uncommon to have both. So if you yourself have both autism and a psychotic disorder, let me know about your experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.